Now, James, originally not from Switzerland, you chose to be here. Why is that?
Well, I decided to come back to business school and went to a school called IMD and stayed there for a year, and my wife and I liked it, and we had 2 young children at the time, and we just thought it would be a good place to raise a family.
To stay. And what is it that you continue to enjoy about Switzerland, you know, bringing up a family here? What were the positives?
Yeah. Well, I think that they have what we really liked was the sense of community. There's a very strong sense of community here. You know, the education system is really excellent at all levels. I think the sense of sort of we versus me, I think there's been a lot of sort of shift in that duality.
What do you mean about we versus me? Maybe you can just expand.
Well, I think all societies live with this duality of sort of being the individual versus being in a community, and some emphasize one more than the other, and I think there's been a bit of a trajectory in some places to move away from the sort of we sense of belonging to the sense of me.
And as a foreigner here, have you always been welcomed? Have you always felt that you've been accepted in Switzerland?
Well, I think the Swiss have there's a bit of xenophobic attitude towards foreigners. There's a love-hate relationship, so I think they're pretty selective about who they welcome and who they accept. And you know, I don't think they have the sort of idyllic Statue of Liberty. We take the weak, we take the hungry, we take the sick. And it's not I don't think it's being easy being an immigrant in many places in the world.
And has the attitude, the culture changed in the years you've been here?
Yeah, I think it has. I do think it's become a much more liberal society and much more upbeat society. So yeah, I think it has improved. Yeah.
You obviously like a lot about Switzerland. Any dislikes about Switzerland, the people, culture?
Well, I spent about half the year here, so I find it quite helpful to be able to get out because it is still quite small. And all of the things we talked about, the sense of community, tend to be defined and sort of overseen by social norms, which are very effective, and I think they're far superior to regulations. But probably the flip side of that is that it is sort of, you do sort of feel as though you're being supervised a little bit or being sort of, to some extent, influenced by these social norms.
And you said an interesting word earlier, xenophobic. Maybe you can just embellish a little bit. What's led Swiss to be like that, do you believe?
I think Switzerland is very unique, you know, in that it resembles, I know Harold James, who's a professor of history at Princeton, told me once that Switzerland, more than any place, resembles medieval Europe. If you look at it, it has this sort of periphery of St. Gallen and Geneva and Basel and Zurich and Lucerne, and each of these are medieval city-states, and to some extent they're even xenophobic among themselves. So I think the allegiance...
Rooted in tradition.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think that's the way it's built.
So you think perhaps Swiss, they don't like each other even? It's nothing to do with foreigners?
I don't know if it's just... I think the sense of trust and allegiance is first within the sort of city-state, and then is a very loose social contract. I mean, I think there's an absolute disdain for central government. You know, taxes are levied, they're assessed and paid at the community and the cantonal level, the state level, with very little money going to the central level. And I think that's a very good thing. But one of the consequences of that is that and one of the reasons it works so well is that the pendulum is sort of balanced at the community and sort of state level, if you like.
You create little pockets, so little countries within the country, basically.
Yeah, that's right. It is a confederation. I mean, it's called Confederation Helvetica, which, by the way, is not too different than the United States. So up until the Civil War, the U.S. was very similar to Switzerland. In fact, Switzerland took the American Constitution. It's basically verbatim, with the exception of very few differences, like the president is a rotating president. But it actually was drawn on the original Constitution of the United States.
And the success of having smaller countries within a country, Switzerland anyway being a small country, you basically say that's one of the reasons why Switzerland is successful. It's smaller, it's manageable. Maybe tell me a little bit more about that idea.
Well, I think because of that, they have these, you know, if you like, 8 independent industrial centers, so social economic systems. And you have, for example, watches in Geneva and private banks, and then you have pharmaceuticals and chemicals. And in Basel, you have textiles and sort of precise machinery in places around St. Gallen. You have Zurich, which is a financial capital, and Lucerne, which has also sort of a concentration of...
everyone has their piece of the pie.
Well, everyone has a piece of a different pie. And I think it's like one of these British naval ships with the corridors. If it takes a torpedo, one side may take water, but the boat continues to float. And I think that's something which is a unnoticed and probably very decisive advantage. And this is why their economic stability has been remarkable. So, at some point, for example, tourism is not doing particularly well right now. But there's other areas which are doing very well.
Almost so it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things.
Well, as long as most of the cylinders hit, yeah, that's right.
Now, you've written about the success of Switzerland and a book called Swiss Made. What made you think you were an authority to speak on such matters? It was just living here and experiencing, or?
Well, I had certain positions which gave me sort of a privileged perch into Swiss society. I was working at Julius Baer at a time when it had 250 people, and my office was between Nicholas Baer, who was president of the Swiss Stock Exchange, and Peter Baer, who was among other things, the chairman of the Quantum Fund, which is very sort of best friends with George Soros. And then
that Swiss working culture that you've experienced, how was that for you?
Yeah, I think it was very foreign in the beginning, but I think it's a good school, very strong work ethic, and as with the economy, very effective working style. So I think it's something that's commendable.
And Switzerland being in the workplace, very much about the network that you have, is that fair to say? Have you experienced that, having a strong network in Switzerland? I mean, it's true for everywhere, but maybe more so in Switzerland, would you say?
I think that the degrees of separation are much narrower here. There's this famous thing that sort of 6 degrees of separation, you can get to anybody from New York to Los Angeles, but I think here you only need 1 or 2 degrees of separation and you've reached everyone. So, in Basel, there's maybe 15 people that you need to really speak to really get to the heart of things. So I think that increases the efficacy of communication and trust considerably.
So in one sentence, and this is going to be tricky, you've written a book about it, but in one sentence, why is Switzerland successful, or has been to date?
In one sentence. I think there's a very strong degree of self-reliance. So I think it's quite important. This idea of sort of depending on the state is something that's very foreign to the Swiss. And I think as well that they place a considerable value at the social level on education. So it's a very well-educated society. And I think they reward enterprise and risk-taking. So the incentives are right. That
self-reliance, when you look at it, there's a lot of foreigners that have come in and been successful here, created wealth here, Nestle as an example. So while Switzerland is successful, it's also owing to the fact that it's had foreign talent as well. Absolutely. But that's not unique to Switzerland. I mean, look at Sergey Brin, look at Jeff Bezos, look at the founder of PayPal. This is the idea of a foreigner being outside of his comfort zone, being willing to take risks, being a more successful entrepreneur. That's the same in the UK, it's the same in South Africa, it's the same in the US, it's the same in Australia. So yes, but yes, in Switzerland, most of the major companies have at least one important foreigner in their history. Now, why will Switzerland continue to be successful? Will it, in your mind, economically speaking, quality of life speaking? I mean, first of all, they're rated now 8 years in a row the most competitive country in the world. So they're coming from a very good starting point, and that there's a whole lot of reasons that sort of constitute that competitiveness. We mentioned the education system. They have the highest per capita number of patent filings in the world. They have, the ETH and the EPFL are among the highest ranking
technical universities in the world. You have the highest density of multinationals in the world by a factor of 4. So you have leading companies in pharmaceuticals and consumer goods like Nestle and financial services. So they're coming from an incredibly good starting point. So I think the key for them will be to what extent can they preserve and prolong the success of these established sort of big oak trees.
And you hear many things.
While fostering sort of the new up-and-coming young companies. So.
And when you think of banking and the end of banking secrecy, they have to reinvent themselves there. When you think of startups and innovation, perhaps it's born here, but then we lose it perhaps to Silicon Valley, for example. What are the concerns that you have potentially for Switzerland?
Well, I think it's important that they're an open society. So they're very, the domestic market for UBS or for Nestle is nothing. It's basically, after 4 or 5 employees as a startup, you have to export. So that has sort of pros and cons. But certainly one of the pros is that you have to be somewhat paranoid about development. So if you're sleeping at the wheel, you can easily go extinct. And I think to some extent part of the recipe, when you mentioned the one sentence, which if I had to add something, is that there is a sense of vulnerability, and this vulnerability keeps them on their toes. And I think that's something that's quite important. And they don't have a domestic market to lean on. So if something goes wrong strategically, very quickly they're non-competitive.
They're not reacting as quickly as they should?
Well, quite the contrary. I think because of that openness and because of that susceptibility,
they're more agile.
Yeah, they're more adaptive than perhaps countries that have a very large domestic market. It's been a field day to bash Swiss banks since the financial crisis. On the one hand, the crisis, and then on the other hand, as you say, this bank secrecy. But the fact is, wealth is growing very fast. And it's, to a large extent, the banking system in Switzerland is sort of the quote, Talib, it's an anti-fragile type of market where if things go bad in places like Turkey or Venezuela, it's great for Swiss banking because people take their wealth to where it's stable. So I think that dichotomy will continue to exist. And so long as that choice as an alternative remains, I think it will continue to be very strong. And the fact is that there's places in the world that really admire the Swiss way of doing business. So if you go to places like Asia, places like the Middle East, places like South America, the Swiss brand really means something. It may not mean something to your viewers in the United States, in Minnesota, or in Kansas, or in Manchester. But if you have money in places like Indonesia...
And why is that brand so strong? It speaks for quality, it speaks for trust, it speaks for...
Well, I mean, you've had 300 defaults, country national defaults, the kind that's being threatened, for example, right now in Venezuela, Argentina, and possibly in Turkey, depending on your view. And, that's been, as I mentioned, if you're having your entire wealth stored in nations like that, coming to places like Switzerland, where the Swiss franc has been head and shoulders above any currency since its inception, compared against the British pound, compared against the US dollar, compared against the Russian ruble, it's been head and shoulders above in terms of preserving value. And that's because of the unique institution of the Swiss National Bank. And this is, in part why they...
Now, James, it's fair to say that you have rubbed shoulders and continue to rub shoulders with influential names in banking, Hans Baer maybe being one of them, who actually said a while ago that banks do need to change. And, maybe tell me more about that. Was he right to say that?
Yeah, but I think they have changed. So I think that he was referring to the bank secrecy, which I think to a large extent has now been remedied. But yes, banks have to change. I mean, part of the problem is that it lies with the customers. The financial illiteracy around the world is incredibly high, and all the studies show that people have a very difficult time understanding simple notions like compounded interest, and so that, in a way, that sort of makes it very easy for banks to sort of take advantage of their clients. So, part of the solution, I think, in the future is that, particularly as retirement periods become much longer.
So you're saying that expertise is still in Switzerland when it comes to navigating a complex investment horizon?
I think that, so coming to the sort of inherent advantages, I think speaking languages, different languages, is still helpful. And having, if you go to places like UBS or Pictet, or they have desks for Middle Eastern clients, they have desks for Japanese clients, and you see Japanese people, you see Arab-speaking people there. I don't know if you see that to the same degree in Barclays or in, JP Morgan, for example. I think, secondly, that by being in Switzerland, again, with this very small home market, I think they have to look above the garden hedge and see where investment products are and which are the most attractive. Whereas if you're in a place like New York, you tend to just sell, promote, recommend American securities. And so I think...
But that race is on still here. I mean, 30% of assets in Switzerland went away post-banking secrecy. So now the game really is to create those innovative products, and every name on the street is trying to do the same thing. So how do you see that unfolding? Consolidation, more boutiques?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think that's come back now. They've lost this 30%, I think, because of the cleansing of the tax-related matters. But that's fully come back, which I think surprised a lot of people. So I think the real surprise about Swiss private banking is it's proved much more resilient than all the doomsday people felt. I don't know whether selling products is what the market wants. I think that's what got the banking system in trouble. I think that the banks that are really the most successful, you take Pictet, for example, I think what they're really selling is the fact that they're not selling products, that they're actually...
Products bring money in, don't they?
Well, that's the problem. Mm-hmm. If your interest is to create revenues for the bank, and the victim is the client, then that's maybe not a sustainable model. And that's exactly what got the banking system into trouble.
How does the banking world make money? Is it purely off the advice?
I think it's moving in that direction. I think it is. I think it's moving. I think fees are contracting around the world. And I think purveyors of product, where you have this conflict of interest of wanting to seek and achieve revenues for an institution at the expense of your client, is fundamentally a flawed model. So,
in terms of investment strategy, is Swiss companies a good investment these days?
Yeah, I think, it depends on which ones, but I think historically they've been very good. The SMI has outperformed the S&P and the MSCI index by loads since 1980, since 1990, since 2000. And the companies have lower leverage and gearing ratios, so I think that's quite good. I think the companies which are really the most exceptional are these sort of hidden gems, market-leading companies, and typically B2B businesses, so they're not consumer-facing. So we don't know who they are because we don't hear about, their products like an iPhone or like a Swatch. And they still tend to be owner-operated or have very large, stable shareholders.
And what makes Switzerland so attractive to, say, the US asset managers? They see the advantage of being here, being present here.
In terms of on the investment side?
Yes.
Well, as these companies, I think they're market leaders in their particular niches. So Schindler is #1 in the world in escalators, #2 in the world in elevators. The world is going vertical, and so you have to build higher buildings because land is constrained. And so you need elevators, and they're the best game in town. And that's all they do is elevators. So I think...
Maybe just a last word on just your thoughts on living here in the country generally. In terms of the female in the working place, has that evolved in terms of, bringing more women into the workplace, making it easier to have families at the same time as careers? Yeah, no, I think the Swiss, unlike their competitive position, I think with regard to gender, they weren't necessarily in the pole position, as you know, so they've gotten off to... They're not always #1, are they, James?
That's right, so they've gotten off to quite a slow start. I think everyone's struggling with gender, to be perfectly honest. I think this, we're all sort of trying to figure out and recalibrate the roles and relationships of the genders, and I think Switzerland is like
Very
anything.
diplomatic way of putting it. Education, you mentioned it's a good education system. Does it continue to be a good education system when you consider the skills we need in the future? The analytical thinking, the computational thinking, the hacking?
Yeah, so I think, if you look at PISA scores, Switzerland, outside of the Asian countries like Singapore, Korea, does extremely well. You have, 75% of people graduating from a university, which is one of the top 200 in the world, which, compared to a place like the UK, would be something like 6%. So it's not this elitist system where either you go to Oxford or Cambridge or nothing. I think you still have this apprenticeship system, which really is a factory for middle-class jobs. But of course, that's under siege because what you learn today in a particular apprenticeship environment may be obsolete in 10 years. I think I read once that 70% of the jobs that people will have if they're 15 years old, 15 years from now will be gone. So it's very difficult to really adjust for that. So I think you're probably going to just...
Very diplomatic answer, James. And last question on the Swiss franc. Do you spend... do you shop in francs?
I pay most of my bills in Swiss francs, so yes, I follow it. It's just about on par with the US dollar these days. It's quite surprising to see how radical currency values have changed, and I think that's symptomatic of the world that we're living in, where maybe central banks are playing too important a role.
And in terms of sort of globalism or the opposite, is Switzerland under threat there?
In what respect?
Well, when you look at US President Trump, for example, protectionism and...
Yeah, I think the Swiss really globalized much before everyone else because they were forced. Historically, what happened is that they actually ended up building factories in places like the United States and Germany because people established quotas, or they all the sort of protectionist steps that we're sort of hearing again today with China, that happened a long time ago. So if you look at the multinationals in Switzerland, they have 1/3 of their revenues and profits, and they have established factories in places like the United States, the UK. So they're already sort of domesticated companies there, full-fledged, tax-paying, sort of good corporate citizens. And
let's hope they keep that friendship up. James, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Amanda. Thank you.